Okay, thank you all very much, and I want to say that today has been absolutely fabulous. I have learned a lot, and that any day where I learn is for me, is a great day. You guys are all doing wonderful, wonderful work, and it's been extremely interesting up to this point. Now that's going to stop with my talk. Because first I'm going to bring my talk up. Let's see if, let's see. I'm going to actually put on my hat as the Chief Science Advisor for OCEARCH. Right there. Okay. So I'm not talking now as a fellow investigator as much as I'm talking about as the Chief Science Advisor. Talk a little bit about the evolution of science in this program since it started in 2007, and talk about process, the science process. So to do that, talk about my own history first. This is how I started. I know Chris in his talks likes to show when he was fishing as a young boy, so I thought I'd put that up. So fishing on the east coast of Florida as a young boy in the summertime. This is what I did during the day, snorkeling. And often at night, we would turn on the TV and watch this fellow. Who in this room doesn't know who this is? Great, I'm glad to hear that. So Jacques Cousteau and his band of merry Frenchmen on the Calypso was literally something that really inspired me to become a marine biologist. And I look back on that and realize how influential that was in my life and my career now of more than 40 years. So today we have this fellow filling this niche, Chris and his wonderful ship, and is also his band of merry men, the crew of the OCEARCH. A tremendous gift that's been given to us as researchers, a ship that costs $25,000 a day to operate, tremendous expertise, and the ability to move and study the animals that we care about anywhere in the world. So when we look back to 2007, when Chris began this quest, we see that the ship has gone on 31 different expeditions involving 21 different locations seen here in many places around the world. This began in 2007 in the East Pacific with work around Guadalupe Island, the southern offshore foraging area, California, and in Mexico in the Sea of Cortez. At that time, there was basically one principal investigator, one scientist that was involved, and that was Mike Domeyer. In 2010, a major change in OCEARCH operations basically occurred with Chris leaving working with Domeyer and starting to work with multiple investigator teams, people like Pete Klimley, Alex Hearn. And they worked in places like the Revilla Hijitos Island in Mexico and Cocos Island in Costa Rica. Then in 2011, to my great fortune, Chris moved the ship to the Atlantic side where we did some work off Florida, and then down into South Africa, where large collaborative teams were formed. In 2012, began the Atlantic White Shark Project, and the first expeditions in Cape Cod and here in Jacksonville. 2014, shipped back to South America, the Galapagos, Chile, and Brazil. 2015 to Australia, both eastern and western coasts. And then the last 3 years, other than the Western Gulf of Mexico study with Matt that he described this morning, most of the work has been focused on the North Atlantic white shark study. So when you look at all the tracks of all the animals, at least since 2010, because the ones before that are not on the tracker, you see that, you know, OCEARCH's animals at least have covered massive areas of the ocean. Ignore this, that's Jimmy Buffett's tour. And this is the ship moving across the Pacific. The rest of these are animal tracks. So we are currently focused on the North Atlantic white shark study, and we have this goal of getting 60 white sharks in the study for 16 different research projects involving a research team from 26 different institutions. This is where we stand right now with the study. The young of the year numbers have been met. Immature, we still have to get about 12 animals, and mature, we only have 5 of the 20 necessary for our sample size. And so we're looking at 4 more expeditions needing 27 more sharks, and about $2 million to fund this work, involving all of these organizations here. We've heard results from many different areas of research today. These are most of the fields represented here. There are more, and we heard from almost all of these today. So this is the scope of OCEARCH science at this point in time. Now, in terms of numbers of people involved and productivity, what we see over the last 12 years is the following: that when we add up all the scientists who've been involved in all these expeditions, 165 scientists from 82 organizations and 8 countries. So that is unbelievable, really a tremendous effort. When we look at the results of this, at this point in time, about 20 peer-reviewed scientific publications have appeared. And I submit to you that from 165 scientists over 12 years, this is not quite where we want to be. So we're all recognizing now that we're in a mode where we need to start putting out the papers, showing the results of OCEARCH research. And we've seen an awful lot of good results today that's publishable. So let's look at the way we used to do things and understand how things have changed. And some of this was actually touched on by Brian this morning. Originally, just to oversimplify things, OCEARCH was kind of offered to the scientific community as a platform of opportunity. We're bringing the ship to your coast. How can we help you? How can you use our ship and our assets for your research? Each expedition had a very limited number of PIs, and originally just one, and then later a couple, and now very different. The researchers would come on board with their own permits and other requirements like the IACUC approval. So that was the responsibility of each of the individual researchers, and it was difficult for the OCEARCH organization to really know if everything was in place and have it in place by the time of an expedition. The scientists, on the other hand, they were being given the ship and room and board, but they have to bring on all their own research equipment, supplies, except for some of the tags. Basically, each expedition, and then take everything off after the expedition is over. We had fairly loose agreements on publications, on the time course and the authorship of research publication, which led to some things kind of being lost, unfortunately, I think. And in addition to that, samples and data became scattered among this researcher network, made it very difficult to track it. Not a problem in most cases, but we've identified some places where we can't find samples that should be there. And finally, primarily shark research was our key. So the trajectory, the evolution of OCEARCH science looks kind of like this. Again, starting with a sort of a single PI model provided a platform of opportunity, going to multiple PIs, more international scope, but still basically a platform of opportunity. Then growing to these larger project teams, expanding the science goals of OCEARCH itself and the areas of research, and then start strategic planning. And then today, more at this level, more of an internally driven mission, building up the science infrastructure, and the affiliation with JU has been monumental for the program. I think you've got a sense of that with Brian's talk this morning, how well organized he is and the affiliation with JU. My appointment as a chief science advisor is part of this. Emphasis now on science productivity and deliverables as opposed to just helping and enabling local scientists. We basically want to see results. So here's OCEARCH Science, what I call the new way. As I said, more internal strategic planning for OCEARCH as an organization, working with the JU folks and me as the chief science advisor. For each expedition, we now have a designated expedition chief scientist who coordinates that expedition and manages the collaborative team that's assembled, often involving dozens of scientists and students. As Brian mentioned this morning, now OCEARCH is obtaining its own federal and state permits for research and fishing as necessary for each expedition so that it's covered centrally. And obviously we have to have good coordination with the expedition chief scientist to know what those requirements are. And similarly, the IACUC plan, which we've never had for OCEARCH, we've always assumed that people had their own IACUCs, which is kind of a risky assumption. Now Jacksonville University has an IACUC. This is the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. And they will now be approving a plan for each expedition covering all of the various procedures that are happening. The goal is to increase the science lab capabilities, improve them to provide more shipboard standing equipment for the scientists so we don't have to bring everything on board every time, supplies and better space instead of just the tackle bar for us. And involving OCEARCH folks, including myself and some others here in the room, in federal and foundation proposals. This was never done before. It was always OCEARCH handled the ship operations, the corporate side, but now we're getting involved a little bit more in the science funding for federal and foundation sources. Those of you who've been on expeditions in recent years know that there's a written signed agreement for collaborating scientists. And part of that agreement involves a pledge, essentially, to publish the results of your data within a reasonable time course. On that agreement, it says 2 years, but that is obviously subject to discussion depending upon the kind of data that's being collected, sample size, and so on. If someone chooses to just let their data sit on a shelf and not work it up, then those data then revert back to OCEARCH and become open access in a sense and can be shared with other researchers. And most people don't have a problem with this part, including OCEARCH as in some sort of authorship capability, capacity, mainly Chris as a co-author and where it's appropriate. Also, as Brian mentioned, samples and data overflow samples are now going to be archived here at JU and organized and curated so that we can track those samples and track data sheets and track the metadata that goes with all the samples. And a big goal is to expand beyond sharks. Everybody probably in this room is interested in the sharks, but we have to say that there's much more out there that we can be using this ship and this program to study. Brian mentioned this. the fact I mentioned that we're now getting involved in writing proposals. We have a pending proposal to the National Science Foundation, which Brian was the lead author on, did a fantastic job, to improve the science infrastructure on the ship. And this was submitted to NSF's program called Biological Field Stations and Marine Labs, and asking for $143,000, primarily to upgrade the science lab and the equipment, the standing equipment that's there, improve the lift and add things to the lift like a digital electronic scale so we can get a better estimate of weight of the animals when they're on the lift, instead of just trying to estimate it based on some lousy algorithm based on length. And also bring satellite internet services back to the ship so that we can communicate as scientists back to shore and get data that we need when we're out at sea and we're outside of cell phone range. So this was submitted in early December. We're very hopeful, but with NSF, the chances are always shaky. It's a very competitive program, but I have a sense that we have a good shot. We should hear about this in probably May or June, I would say. Right, Brian? So if we get this funding, then over the course of the next year, we'll be making these great improvements to the ship. Other proposals that are being worked on or have been submitted, two of them by Mike Hyatt with Harley and Lisa. One was to the Morris, the Morris Animal Foundation. Unfortunately, that was declined. And that was basically for supplies for the kind of work that Lisa and Harley and Mike do. Another one is they're preparing to submit, I think, in a week or so to AZA, and we have hopes for that being funded. So for the future, and we're going to talk about this tomorrow, discuss our plans for the future for the OCEARCH program and for improving the collaboration between science and OCEARCH and making things even better for the scientists on board. We're looking at 3 expeditions potentially. The first 2 are more solid. That's the Gulf Stream Drift coming up in end of May, June. The second one is work off of Atlantic Canada. The Gulf Stream Drift is not white shark oriented. It's not white shark centric, I should say. It's going to possibly involve everything from oceanography to turtles, billfish, sharks, sargassum, you name it, whales, marine mammals. And then, but Atlantic Canada, we're hopeful we'll get our permits approved and we can go and really get good numbers of white sharks up in those waters. And you all have seen the tracks today that show the movements of white sharks into this area off Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. And the third one, off to the future, we're not sure when, but maybe in a couple of years, is to take the ship to the Med and spend some time in the Mediterranean looking for whatever white sharks are left in that body of water and other things. It's a tremendously fascinating place. It's also a place that's in huge trouble, and it could really use our help. So that is it. That's my little wrap-up of the evolution of OCEARCH science. And like I said, I offer this more as food for thought for our discussion tomorrow. And I thank you very much, and be happy to answer any questions.